Some brochures here at both the table and back and at front if you're interested. Also the website ccirc.org, easy to remember. Once you hear the program tonight, you can go there and learn more about what we do and how to sign up.
Okay, so please help me welcome John Buckley.
So good evening. Thanks for giving a Friday night to try and learn about something that I hope is of importance to you. I'm going to try to do this without the microphone. Is there anyone that right now feels like that it would be better? Raise your hand if you feel like I need to use the microphone. Okay, well, thank you. So, as was mentioned, tonight I'm going to be talking about fires, about forest resiliency and climate change. And part of it is, well, why do I have any reason to be talking on those topics? In part because of my background in fire. So I spent 13 years as a firefighter with the Forest Service, traveling all over the United States, most of those years on hotshot fire crews, fighting fires in a wide variety of habitats, and also from Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina to Idaho and Washington, Arizona, New Mexico, all over where fires were burning. Part of that experience was understanding more about fire. I was active in more than 200 different fires that were major fires across the West or back east, but also understanding more about the forests themselves. And so at one point, even though I really enjoyed firefighting, I left the Forest Service to try to respond to issues that were happening in forests across the West, but especially in the area where I lived, in the area up in north of Yosemite, in the Stanislaus National Forest area, and in the foothills and lands around it. So I am not tonight talking about forest issues related to the environment other than when they overlap with how we've changed the forest ecosystem. But I left the Forest Service to try and help find solutions to logging issues or forest management issues, to livestock grazing impacts on public lands in particular, to issues of wildlife species that were fading away. This is the Pacific fisher. Pacific fisher is extirpated at this point based on surveys north of the Merced River in Yosemite Park. Even where there are some areas that there's suitable habitat, there's no conclusive proof, although we hear of sightings that our center attempts to follow up on. And I, again, don't have slideshows, but I often put on programs simply about wildlife because most people care about wildlife and they're good representatives for the health of an ecosystem. Another issue that I left the Forest Service and firefighting for was to try and make a difference on water issues. Again, there are so many water issues that are complex, and they're often referred to as wicked problems because there's no easy solution with water rights, with overdemands, so many different things that are affecting them. But tonight I'm going to be talking about the Sierra Nevada forests, what was here historically, how we have changed what was here, and how a changing climate is exacerbating the problem. So there's no test at the end of this, obviously, and you don't have to understand all of the key points that are sort of summarized here, but the ones that I have in blue are at least somewhat of concern. The region's forests overall are unhealthy, certain wildlife species are disappearing, almost all of the river and streams have more demands on them than they have the capacity to provide, especially in drought periods, and climate change has already resulted in a number of megafires. So this was my best attempt to bring a little humor into it. This is the only one I will try tonight. But if you think of the Sierra Nevada forest ecosystem as the patient, the doctor would say you're out of shape, you have numerous diseases, you need a lifestyle change, plus you need a lot of luck and some cutting edge treatments. And then the reality is things aren't looking good even with all of that. So when I was talking with Richard beforehand, this could be a very grim presentation that seems very negative, but I actually hope that you see that at the end of it, I think there are some opportunities to turn things around if enough people care, if we can get our Congress, our president, others to make choices, maybe not this Congress or this president, but at some point to make changes that will lead to solutions. So I'm going to go through here and talk now about what was here before we began changing it. So if we talk about the forests of the Sierra Nevada, there is no forest of the Sierra Nevada. There are all these different forest species out there, tree species out there, that have different parts of the ecosystem that they've adapted to because of certain demands for those particular species. So the aspens are different from the mixed conifer forest that may be in the middle elevations. They're different from the gray pines and the brush species that you might find in the serpentine soils across in the red hills or some other areas in the foothills. And then we have the blue oak woodlands that cover millions of acres of the foothills and actually mostly are old growth forests. If you think of trees that are at least 150 to 300 years of age, most of the blue oaks, even a relatively small diameter, are quite old, and there's not a lot of young blue oaks coming up in many of these areas. The forests are also affected by elevation. So when we go up to 8,000 feet here near Levitt Meadow, and even higher in the peaks in behind it, well, this is a lodgepole forest right here that I took a picture of, and just about 2 miles away on a south-facing slope with different soils and different exposure, we have Jeffrey pine forest. Different wildlife perhaps at different times of the year, very different, even though it's all in the same forest belt. And then we have the mixed conifer forest that most of you think of when you think of forest across the National Forest or Yosemite Park, because these are the areas around Yosemite Valley, on up across into the Stanislaus Forest and Pinecrest and Lake Alpine and many of the other areas that are popular for recreation. It also depends when we talk about Sierra Nevada forest, are you at the south end of the range or are you at the north end of the range? So when we're up north of Tahoe, much more moisture, milder climate, or milder temperatures, excuse me, than you are down in Sequoia Kings Canyon or the Sierra or Sequoia National Forest at the south end of the range. So I went through, partly in preparation for this program, but also when I put on other programs, and looked back to see what photos were available in Forest Service files and other places of what did the forest look like after, literally thousands of years of fire being part of the environment from lightning fires and from the Miwok and Yoka, no, not so much the Yoka, but the Miwok people lighting fires up in the region to help open up the forest stands around their village or to do things that would benefit the plants they use. So imagine you're standing in this forest. It's open, it's park-like, lots of big trees. It's an example of typical mixed conifer or in some cases white fir, red fir forest that had frequent fire come through. And this is another classic example in the late 1800s, early 1900s, even though they started suppressing fires in the 1890s in many cases, 1880s in some areas, the forest had old trees. These ponderosa pines here in the front might be 150 to 250, 300 years old. And while it looks like there's quite a few trees, you're looking a long way through the stand. And actually, there's a lot of area here that's very open and park-like. You can also see in this picture, and this is actually based on transects that were done along what's now the western edge of Yosemite Park in an area that's up out of the Tuolumne River Canyon. There were transects that were done, inventories that were done in 1910, and they showed only about 20 trees per acre, but many of them were large old growth trees like the large ponderosa in this picture. There's some other pines that are back in there that are hard to tell. There was white fir, Douglas fir, and incense cedar and others, but it was generally open and park-like with lots of oaks that liked the sun mixed in and relatively minimal levels of brush and ground covers and other things because fires burn through frequently, and I'll be talking about that. So we've affected the forests. And in many ways, it was almost at first seen a challenge. The dark, overwhelming forests, we need to, burn them back or cut them back and create places for farms around communities, or for communities to spread out and graze their cows or sheep or whatever it might be. But also, there was a demand for wood, especially in the years when there were booming developments that were taking place across parts of the Central Valley, the Sacramento region, or into the Bay Area. And so this is at the most extreme, where the giant sequoias had men who would work sometimes for literally weeks on end with their long saws, crosscut saws, to eventually cut these giant trees that might be 2,000 years of age. The volume, the weight of many of the trees was so tremendous that when they hit the ground, they often exploded, splintered, and were basically worthless. And so they'd move over and cut another tree and hope that when it hit the ground that it didn't splinter so much, and they could make it into shakes that went on people's roofs, and it wasn't structural lumber. And so it was an example of the sort of careless, wanton attacks on priceless old trees that had survived in some cases for well over 1,000 years, and yet it was part of the mentality at the time of conquering nature. So these are early photos, but the giant sequoias were just a tiny percentage. The vast majority of the forests were the pine forests across the lower belts of the forest, the lower elevations, and then the mixed conifer, and then white fir, red fir, before you got up into the lodgepole. And generally, most of the logging operations, especially in the early eras, were in the pine forest. This giant sugar pine could easily be, 10-foot diameter is an example. They obviously thought this was an impressive tree. Just a majority of the tree fills all of these railroad cars, and there was another 100 feet or so of the tree that isn't even shown in this picture. These were giant trees, and systematically they were high graded as they worked across the landscape. So logging was spreading out from the communities and targeting the biggest and best groves, and then fires would happen. And I've gone through and done quite a bit of reading. Most of the fires in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, even in some places past 1900, they would go out sometimes just with gunny sacks, or they would go out with, here in this case, just with some rakes, and they rake back the leaves, the oak leaves or the pine needles, and just create a fire line. The fire would come up to it and it would go out. And I can tell you, having been in fire crews more recently, that's not the situation in the recent decades. So you can see these guys don't even have shirts on because it's hot, but they're certainly not feeling the tremendous heat of a wildfire rushing at them. It's an example of they're out there, they're scraping back. It doesn't take much because the forests were open and park-like, and the fires spread at a low rate of spread. But back in the Midwest, in Michigan, Minnesota, and some of those areas, they had logging slash from as much as 3 to 4 decades that had accumulated, and they had some fires back there under extreme conditions that burned up towns, that killed people. In I think a few hundred people died in one of the fires. And across the country, the mentality became, we need to fight evil fires. And so forest defense is national defense became the mantra. And fire crews were assigned to try and stop each fire. And when the Forest Service formed, the National Forest Service, the National Forest formed, they ended up with a 10 a.m. policy where the goal was to make sure every fire that started was out by 10 a.m. the next day. Because fires are bad. We need to stop them and put them out. And so in the 1930s, under Roosevelt, when we had the Civilian Conservation Corps, 300,000 men across the country were assigned over, I think it was a 10 or 11 year period, to go out and do work camps And here's an example of going out and do projects in the national forest and national parks and state parks and other areas on natural resource lands. And they went out and they built lookout towers and they cleared fuel breaks and they did all kinds of things, including fighting fire. And it was one of the first times where across the country, many people from cities, or they didn't really call it suburbia yet, but went out into these natural areas and started to experience them. And they came back with, I think overall, the amount of time with all the men that were out there, they came back with many different experiences that encourage more people to go out into their public forests, their national parks and other places, but also with this belief that it was important to put out fires. And again, some of the people who were involved at that time, some of the men. So afterwards, in the 40s and into the 1950s, they began to use mechanized equipment to try and put out fires. It kept evolving into the 60s and the 70s with more and more high-tech fire engines. There were retardant drop planes which would drop. They originally called it borate, but eventually it was actually a fertilizer, ammonium sulfate, that would help to stop the fires by retarding the ability for the fire to burn that particular vegetation until it had totally dried out. And so it was like a slimy, if you're out there on a fire crew and one of the planes comes over and drops, it's like orange snot. It's just this stuff that if it hits you, once it dries, it's not that other than it smells like ammonia, but it's not the most pleasant stuff to be exposed to. But it's effective only if there are fire crews that get right in behind it and then help it to work. And then especially after the Korean War, and then after a lot of pilots were coming back from Vietnam, they began to use helicopters more and more and more for water drops and for all of these different types of suppression efforts against forest fires. And forest fires continued even up into the 1990s and into the early 2000s to be seen as something that had to be put out. And so if you think about terminology, firefighters, if you have a crew like when I was on engine crews or whatever, initial attack crews to go out to fight the fire, incident commanders for those that are running the fire. It was a philosophy in our country of trying to suppress fires. And again, hotshot crews and other crews that were on the front lines, the entire premise was we need to stop the fire, not to manage it, not to let it burn under conditions that would do good for the environment, but to suppress the fire. So if we step back for a minute to see that we had forests that had large old growth trees that in some cases had grown for hundreds of years with relatively open stands, and then scattered smaller and mid-sized trees, they were very resilient to fires because as fires would burn, first the older trees, there's nothing to burn in the lower parts of it. The bark is fire resistant up to a certain point. The trees have thick bark that protects the cambium layer underneath, and it was only the smaller material that every time there was a natural lightning fire or a Miwok or Native American lit fire, it would burn many of the small trees, the pine needles, the branches and others, but leave most of the forest intact. And again, an example here with old growth trees, well, once they're cut down, now you have all these mid-sized trees that have grown up since fires were starting to be suppressed, and now the forest becomes a thicket of second growth or third growth trees. So as big trees were cut, the smaller trees that had grown up around them over the 20, 30, 40 years became, especially in the pine forest, this explosion of growth of pines, firs, and to some degree white firs that were shade tolerant underneath. So the forest, instead of being open and park-like, across much of the Sierra Nevada and many other places in California, Oregon, and other places in the West, began to be thickets dense stands of forest. And this is more in the mixed conifer rather than the pine belt. But you can see not only are there young trees, mid-sized trees, older trees, all in thickets, but the fuel ladder, the ability for the fire to be burning on the forest floor, burn into here, and then to flare up into it. If there was any wind at all, it'd become a crown fire, and then you get high severity burn effects. So on top of all of those changes that were being caused by suppressing fires and removing the large fire-resistant trees, on private lands first, after they'd logged almost all of the large trees off of their private lands, they would then have young second growth trees or mid-sized second growth trees that they hadn't bothered to cut the first time. Now you add fairly thick forests of trees somewhat the same age, at least in the bigger medium-sized trees. So lumber companies would then go through and clear cut, and the state of California provided new forest practice rules that allowed clear cuts, 40 acres, 20 acres. Early it was 40 and even up to 60. Gradually it's been shrunk down to about 20 acres in size. And yet on our national forest lands, where the goal is multiple use and the benefit the American taxpayer, from the 1950s and 60s on through into the actually near the end of the 1990s, the Forest Service was clear cutting on public forest lands, 40-acre blocks like the one I took pictures of here, with just cutting down everything, bulldozing or ripping and tearing the site up, and then replanting with a new crop of trees, often at a loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars per site to the taxpayers. That all of that expense was coming from at almost no revenue for the wood at all from the lumber companies. So site after site on both private and public lands, this happens to be on the national forest, were forest areas, and I'm just calling it natural forest, the areas that are up above with trees of different sizes and different species and everything. Many of these areas were clear cut and converted into tree plantations. And often all the same size, the same shape. This is just a classic one. These are happening today on private lands, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But in the Sierra Nevada, this was happening for many, many decades, wherever they chose the biggest and best trees, and they went out and clear cut that grove and then converted it into a tree plantation. Again, almost always at a loss to taxpayers and always at a loss to the environment. So in the 1990s, conservation groups, including our center, which had formed in 1990, began to try and change the Forest Service, not on private lands, but the Forest Service, away from clear cutting and cutting the large, old, fire-resistant trees. And at that time, the only avenue to do that was to identify a species that was declining and may become endangered based on what the government was doing. So the California spotted owl had lawsuits that were pressing the Forest Service to stop those practices, and the Forest Service agreed to assemble a team of researchers, of wildlife specialists, and they produced what was called the CAO report. CA for California, for California, SPO for spotted owls. So the CASPO report said that they should stop clear cutting and they should protect large diameter trees, but not just for the California spotted owl, but for the Pacific fisher, for the northern flying squirrel, for the pileated woodpecker, for a wide variety of species that were dependent on large trees, large snags, large down logs, and some amount of canopy cover in the forest. So the Forest Service in the late 1990s shifted to a new approach with no more clear cutting in the Sierra Nevada. It's an important thing to recognize. They stopped in the mid-1990s from cutting in the Sierra Nevada by clear cut on national forest lands, and they began doing thinning logging treatments. Many of them weren't based on any kind of what's good for the environment type approach, but more, let's space the trees 20 feet or so apart. We'll leave 30 to 40% of the stand in trees and removed the rest for wood, but it was a huge improvement over the clear cuts. And they were mandated to leave trees 30 inches and larger. They were called the Caspel Guidelines. Trees 30 inches and larger at 4.5 diameter foot breast height. Don't ask me why. That's just how foresters have always done it. Is 4.5 feet up is where you measure the tree to determine the diameter of that tree. So large trees for the first time began to be spared, but there were only a few areas in many parts of the national forest where there were any large trees left, because there'd been more or less 80 to 100 years of logging. The new kind of logging was a thinning logging that was very conducive to new types of logging equipment. This is called a feller buncher. So it's like a bulldozer that drives up to a tree. The grippers grab the tree and they grab onto it. It has a chainsaw at the base of the grippers that cuts the tree, and it lifts the tree straight up in the air, flips it sideways and puts it on the ground. Moves to the next tree, grabs it, lifts it straight up, drops it into the pile. And it's very productive and effective, but one of the reasons the timber industry shifted to them is if you have people just cutting with a chainsaw, when you're thinning, a tree falls over and lands against other trees. How do you get it out? This kind of equipment is powerful enough to just grab it and rip it. And so many loggers lost their jobs when the timber industry shifted to cutting the thinning logging on national forest lands. However, on private lands, Sierra Pacific Industries owned about 1.5 million acres of the most productive lands in the Sierra Nevada, and they and other companies continued to clear cut. And for the period of time all the way from the 1990s up till today, when there were logging trucks coming down the road yesterday, I didn't see today, but clear cuts are still being cut on private lands up in the Sierra Nevada. And most of them are not where they take every single tree. They do what they call a visual retention cut. A visual retention cut is you leave a few trees to soften the clear cut if somebody sees it visually. So it's like a public relations thing, but they do it to be sensitive to people that say it looks ugly when you've cut everything. So instead, they cut where they do leave a number of little trees here and there. They often will cut them down at some point later, but they are still continuing, and most of their cut units are 20, at the most 30 acres in size. They also don't have any economic value for the giant old oaks or other hardwoods that are out there. There's just not a market for it. There's not even a productive economic market for firewood enough to bring the trees up the hillside to get them to a place where they can be cut up, and it's not economical. So Sierra Pacific Industries and other private lumber companies just drag them into piles, burn them, and so trees, in this case, some of these oaks here are at least 250, 300 years of age. The biologists who worked with our center, here's some other oaks. Some of them are 4-foot diameter, probably over 300 years of age, and again, just cut, bulldozed, and burned. And the oaks have the highest ecological value of any of the vegetation out there in the forest, because structurally they provide so much habitat for a wide variety of species, and they produce acorns. And the giant trees produce a huge amount of acorns that are food for many species. On private lands as well as on public lands, a wide use of herbicides has been going on for decades, but especially since the 1960s. They use a variety of chemicals, active ingredients, glyphosate and simazine, atrazine, hexazinone, other chemicals that the glyphosate, it's sprayed onto the foliage basically overgrows and dies. The others, hexazinone, atrazine, and simazine, others, are taken up by the roots into the plants and they die. And it's a very effective way to eliminate competition so that the amount of vegetation that's competing with your crop of new seedlings that are put in the ground after a clear cut, that you've eliminated the competition. So this is on SPI land where I took this picture a few years ago. It's the most extreme, where not only had they burned the site after bulldozing it and first cutting all the trees and then bulldozing it, but also they had used herbicides after burning it, so that it really was bare mineral soil and they could have the least amount of competition. And I was out earlier this week on sites up near Cherry Lake where 10,000 acres of area was planted, and again, a lot of it looks similar to this because of so many herbicides that have been used. So if you get up airily and you fly in a small plane, like I did a number of times along the Highway 4 corridor, or some of the places out near Duckwall Mountain, other areas in the forest, you can see where the private lumber company lands are, because they have these scattered clear cuts that are scattered across the landscape. And this is miles across. You can see that they may cut 20 acres here and 20 acres here and 18 there, 16 there, 14 there, 18 or 20 there, and on. But usually, and again, some of these might even be 22 or 23 because they average around 20. And then later, a few years later, they come in, and once the trees have grown into a tree plantation on the clear-cut site where they used herbicides, they killed off everything, they planted a crop of trees, you now have these areas that are uniformly all generally ponderosa pines and some Douglas firs that are all 6, 8, 10 feet high, but they're truly right against each other, and they create this incredible fuel if a wind comes through and is affecting the fire. So think about the forest that we're here with very large individual trees. Excuse me. And then think how it's been changed into pretty much uniform vegetation that can all burn under right conditions with even age blocks across the landscape. So on private lands, the clear cutting has continued. On public lands, the Forest Service not only switched in the 1990s, late 1990s, to thinning the forest, so this is a landing, but thinning the forest in behind, but over the last 10 years or so, I'll talk about in a minute, they really have attempted to start to replicate the natural historic conditions where they're doing new thinning logging treatments. This is an area that I just took a picture on back on Monday last week, up in an area where they just finished a logging project. This is after all the logging's done. So they still have large trees, medium-sized trees, some scattered small, and once it's been underburned with a general prescribed fire, and they get the ground covers and the wildflowers and the ferns, sprouting back up, this area will look more like what it used to be. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the forests are not able to be easily thinned and logged because either they're on steep terrain, which this one isn't, or the Forest Service doesn't have enough staff to go out and mark the trees, lay out the sales, administer the sale, and do all the things that are needed to get the forest opened up, thinned, the large trees protected with buffers around them where possible, and openings so that the oaks and the dogwoods and the alders and the maples and the ferns and other plants can get sunlight into the stand. Instead, much of the forest looks like this because the Forest Service doesn't have the capacity to do the work that it agrees needs to be done. This particular site, I took this picture before the rim fire. This particular site, not a single tree survived, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So even at higher elevations, this is up toward the Clark Fork area, up toward the Sonora Pass, forests have now become so thick, even in sites that are somewhat poor soil sites, that the fuels are directly adjacent to each other, and when a wildfire burns with any kind of wind on it, it just rips through. The fire severity isn't low intensity, but tends to be hotter. So I was looking back through my photos, and these pictures are taken around 1990, 1993 of a really hot fire that was exceptional for that time because it had burned at high severity after all these years where most of the fires that we'd seen had burned at moderate severity, except in the brush fields of Southern California or some of the desert areas where fuels got so incredibly dry. But in these sites, if I get this to go, here we go. These were early pictures of some of the first high severity burns, and it wasn't even on a cliff where the flames were preheating as they rushed up the hillside. It just was because so much fuel was out there. And another example. So the Forest Service has fought against fires back from Smokey the Bear, you know, only you can prevent forest fires, and with a message that even now you see on TV, even sometimes between the football games, is that only you can prevent forest fires, when in reality the forest evolved with fires. But because there are places that have the devastating fires that all of us have been seeing in terms of Santa Rosa and Napa and Mendocino and so many other places, the public has a message or a thought: we need to suppress fires, we need to save homes. In reality, if we had prescribed or low intensity managed fires that prevented there from being such an accumulation of fuel out there, it would be far safer and there'd be far less threats to the community. Today, the Forest Service and other fire agencies has the highest technology possible. They have huge retardant planes. They have fleets of helicopters. They have, on some fires, there can be more than 500 fire engines show up. But we cannot prevail under conditions like burned in Santa Rosa or other places against fires that are basically unstoppable. And that's because things changed since we first began managing the forests of the Sierra Nevada. And I'm going to rush through this real quickly, but the first is there's climate change. The snowpack of the Sierra Nevada used to be, even in the spring, down to 3,000 or 4,000 feet into the middle of spring. Since 2001, 16 of the 17 warmest years on our planet, 16 of the 17 warmest years on our planet have occurred since 2001. And the rise in temperature means less snowpack, earlier snow melt, and a longer fire season. Studies that I was just looking at a few weeks ago is the fire season since in the last 30 years has grown to be roughly 7 weeks longer in the Sierra Nevada. Well, that really matters because fuels keep drying out from the spring when they're soaked and saturated on through. They get dry, they get drier, they get drier. Now when you add 7 more weeks onto the fire season, the fuels, and we have 1-hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, all these different ways of looking at fuels, but the fuels get so dry, they're almost explosive when they're burned especially under windy condition. We also had the most severe drought in the state's history. Some state claims where it was the worst in 800 years, other was the worst in 1,200 years based on tree rings and other things. However you look at it, it was the most severe drought in the state's recorded history, and it resulted in an eruption of bark beetles and tree mortality. So we had the drought, and it lasted not just 1 year, but it really lasted for 4 years, being severe, and then a 5th year. In the midst of it, we had the Rim Fire, 2013, a fire that burned 400 square miles up in the Sierra Nevada. 400 square miles. All of the red was high severity. It meant every mature tree on that site was killed. We never used to have fires like this, even under the most extreme conditions, except in brush fields in Southern California, where it built up for years and years and then it all burned. But in the Sierra Nevada, this was the biggest wildfire ever recorded and the most severe ever recorded. The next year there was a King Fire. Then the year after that there was a Ridge Fire. Again, huge areas burned. I think 90,000 acres or something in the King Fire. This was 237,000 acres or something like that total. But again, 400 square miles. I got in a small plane. It takes 1 hour to just simply fly around the outside of this fire, and we actually didn't do the complete flight. So you can see what vegetation burns like under high severity when you go to places in Yosemite Park that were burning at that time. Or when you see that on 2 days in the midst of the rim fire, as the fire was working its way up slope, it was consuming so much fuel under such dry conditions that it developed this pyrocumulus cloud, this thunderhead type cloud, and the oxygen sucking into it just erupted, and literally there was a gaseous flame cloud that just nuked everything down below. It killed the trees, it killed the wildlife, it killed everything that was down below. Over 80,000 acres in 2 days. Didn't matter about retardant drops or anything. This is again an area near Yosemite Park. There was so much that was burning so hot. The smoke was tremendous for weeks, for almost a month. The air quality was outrageous. And after the fire stopped, this is from what's called Rim of the World. I took this picture. It was just heartbreaking. There used to be forest in that canyon all the way up. This is, when you're looking far up into it, the edge of it is Yosemite Park. And many of the forest, literally, it's just as if a blowtorch had blown through. There weren't any pine needles. There weren't any small branch thing. It just roasted so hot. So the rim fire was an example of, it's not just about we're killing trees. We're greatly altering this ecosystem that had developed over so many thousands of years with frequent burns that in many cases came through every 6 to 12 years, low intensity, kept the forest open and park-like, didn't harm the largest trees, and again, we're just cleansing out the buildup of fuel. This is Corral Creek. That's Julia of our staff standing there. And again, it's just heartbreaking, and it's not something that we want for our forest. So the drought continued, and bark beetles in the 3rd year went nuts. And the bark beetles, because they had extra brood season, so just think if if one beetle lays 200 eggs, half of those survive, and then they each lay eggs, and half of those survive. At the end of the season, you've had 3 broods. You have this huge number of beetles. Now you multiply that out by a 4th brood that might happen in a drought year, and then you have it happen the 2nd year. And so if you started with 1,000 beetles, you've not only got to, 1 trillion beetles at the end of the 2nd year, but now into the 3rd year, they're all multiplying, they're laying more eggs, and the amount of damage is it's beyond description. So they're actually quite small, maybe 3/8 of an inch long. There's one in the top right. This one's a little harder to see here, right here. But the bark beetles, they lay their eggs. The larvae create these galleries underneath the bark. They girdle the tree, and the tree dies. And it doesn't just affect a tree here or a tree there. When they're at astronomical numbers, the trees, when they bore into them, sap flows. That's supposed to push the beetle out. But when it's a drought year, after so much sap is pushed back against the beetles, there's no more sap. The beetles just take over. And what ended up with was some of the reports that were in the newspapers. The Forest Service accounted 100 million dead trees back in the spring of 2016. Well, there were probably another 30 to 50 million that died after that, and that was just trees over a certain size. This is a poor picture, I apologize, but I was trying to take it through some shadows and it didn't come out well. But it's just an example. This is what's called the basin in North Fork, Tuolumne. You can see all of those pines are dying. The ones that are kind of yellowish are starting to die, and the area above it was oak and brush until you got up to the ridge, and then most of the trees were dying up at the ridge. This was typical. Wherever you go out in the forest during the height of the drought, the bark beetles were killing a high percentage, not most, but a high percentage of the trees. In some places, over near the western edge of Yosemite Park, they called it a red tsunami. There's so many trees died from bark beetles that just spread across the forest. And so you would think, well, at least we have wood for our mills because people want to have the dead trees cut. But just 3 years before, we had the rim fire. 400 million board feet of dead trees were taken out from that fire to try and reduce the amount of dead trees that were out there, which was just a fraction of the overall dead trees. The mills were clogged with dead trees. They didn't want more dead trees from bark beetles. And so there's an even greater challenge in the southern half of the Sierra Nevada. Because of a lot of things that have changed over the years, there's only a single mill. This isn't it. This is one in Chinese camp. There's only a single mill for the bottom quarter or so of the entire mountain range that can even take wood. So if you don't have a market to remove trees, what do you do with tens of millions of dead trees that are out there that need to be changed or need to be removed? So this was at a conference I was at back in the spring this year with Forest Service, Park Service, state foresters, and others. This is historical up to what's known up to 2014 or so of bark beetles across the western U.S. Nothing had ever been documented to be anywhere close to what happened in 2010 to 2015. And yet, all the scientists collectively agreed this is what the best estimates are going to be for bark beetles across the West because of climate change and fuel conditions in the next few years. So this is down on the Sierra National Forest. Breaks my heart to go and see these kinds of places because those are forests that were habitat for a lot of wildlife and great places for people, for recreation, for their vacations, for all the places. This one's near Bass Lake. This is about the most extreme in any place. But it's just an example of this is not how forests used to be. This is a tragic change in forest conditions that is setting a whole new pattern. So what are some solutions and where can we go? This is called the Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions Collaborative Group. And I was fortunate to be co-chair with a guy from the timber industry for 2 years, and I've served on the leadership team, 5 of us as leaders for this collaborative group from the timber industry, county supervisors, business interests, environmental groups, all these interests who are involved in the forest. How can we find middle ground, workable solutions to deal with the bark beetles, to deal with drought, to deal with fire fuel effects? This is a field trip that we organized, a number of us, just 3 weeks ago out in the forest to talk with Forest Service officials, to talk with politicians and others. What can we do to get forest? And I found this spot, which was an example of what the science shows as most consistent in the historic forests that were inventoried is big trees, open areas, lots of ground covers, park-like, very low fire risk. It's an example, but it's just a tiny patch that happened to be in the midst of a lot of unhealthy forests. So for those of you that are students in particular, 2 documents to look up afterwards. One is called GTR 220. It's called Pacific Southwest Station GTR General Technical Report 220. GTR 220. Dr. Malcolm North, Peter Stein, Bill Zielinski, Scott Stevens, they collectively put together how can we manage the forests of the Sierra Nevada and get them back into an ecological condition that can get them more healthy. There's a blurry picture, but it was one that was taken and is in that report as they flew over a forest in Mexico in the Sierra Madre that has never been logged, has no roads into it, is an area that's just never been economically worth getting out there to log. And fires burn through because no one puts them out. And this is replicating what was more the condition of the historic forest. Individual trees dominating most of the site with some clumps and some openings. So they call it individual I, clumps C, and O openings, the ICO approach. And I'll have a couple pictures on that. But they took pictures from the 1920s to show that in many places that's what it looked like. And their proposal was create very, very open stands on ridges where fires will burn up and firefighters can more or less control them, have more open but not as open as the ridges on the mid slopes, and only have fairly thick forest stands in the lower 1/3 of slopes, and even then do it in an ICO pattern. In 2012 they came out with a follow-up GTR document called 237, and this one was done by even more scientists, and one of the things it had in it was something that I noted the other day. Mean annual surface air temperatures in California are predicted to increase by as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the next century, creating climatic conditions unprecedented in at least the last 2 million years. Yet climate change is by no means the only stress on forest ecosystems. So we already have all of the problems of the existing drought, and what they put forward was we need open park-like forest under an ICO type condition because we have increased fire severity, larger fire size, and increased fire activity, a larger fire size, and a higher degree of fire severity. They went back and looked at some of the plots and saw really open stands with scattered trees, openings, and clumps, just like some of the early transects had proven. And they've tried to replicate it in an area called the experimental forest up in the area near Pinecrest. Another scientist, Dr. Mark Meyer, had a whole report which was similar. Historical individual trees, clumps of trees, and openings. This is what it used to look like. This is what we need to get it back to if we're going to have forests that survive. So the YSS, the Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions Group, another one that our center's involved in, Amador Calaveras Consensus Group, other groups are trying to find how can we get the funding and the Forest Service cooperation and support to plan thinning logging sales that can open up the forest, leave them with the larger trees and medium scattered trees that will create those kinds of conditions. And also, this was this summer when there are wildfires that are burning that are not threatening anyone's home, and they're burning under conditions with no strong winds, and they're more or less just spreading slowly across the forest. Manage them as managed wildfires, similar to prescribed burns, and let them do what fires naturally did rather than spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to put them out. In addition, back last week, I was, actually it's Friday, so it was this week on Monday, I was at a prescribed fire council meeting down near Fresno where Forest Service, Park Service, CAL FIRE, and other folks were talking about the only way to deal with the kinds of fires that are in Santa Rosa, Napa, Mendocino, and other places is to get low intensity fire into as many strategically placed treatments as possible before fires get to those kinds of extreme conditions, so they burn into those areas and there's less fuel, and also that the forests start to get fire back into the ecosystem. If we can get to the next, there we go, with prescribed burns, and get them to understory burn in a fashion that will, in some cases, deal with all these dead trees that have built up so much because of the drought conditions. So fire is a dominant factor in the forest environment. And the collaborative groups working are putting forward solutions, but when we met with the Forest Service said, we're so glad finally everybody's on the same page, but under our current budgets, we don't have enough money to even do the work we've done up to now, which is greatly inadequate. And unless things change, you can't expect more from us. In part, where I have underlined, when we have fires that burn all over, and we're going to have more fires burn this fall in Southern California under Santa Ana conditions. Just, it's a reality. All of the funding to fight those fires comes on Forest Service lands, comes out of the Forest Service's regular budget. So the treatments they need to do to get the forest healthy again, like thinning or prescribed burning, they steal the money from those funds to fight the fires. Well, the projects that would reduce the hot, destructive wildfires don't get done because they take the money to fight the fires. It's one of the real puzzlers in terms of, you either pay now or you pay in the future, but you can save so much more if you get the prescribed treatments done. And here's another thing. I'm an environmentalist. I openly acknowledge that's a bias I have. I work to protect water, wildlife, and wild places. But we have some groups, a small percentage of groups out there that actually their entire mission is to stop the Forest Service from doing projects with chainsaws or with reforestation, because they've seen in the past the Forest Service clear cut, the Forest Service do bad things, and they don't trust the Forest Service. So some of these groups litigate against every project that goes forward, which makes them delayed for years or in many cases not happen. And in response, we then have politicians in Congress who put forward legislation. There's one that's going to be voted on next week that would exempt any environmental policies for projects up to 30,000 acres of logging in a single project. It's like going all the way to the other extreme, and also would undermine the Endangered Species Act. And for groups that were showing that the Forest Service is doing something illegal, no longer would they ever get their legal fees back when they win and show in court. So you guys wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't care about informing and educating yourselves. So everyone in this room is aware that we have climate change occurring, that we have a clicker that is malfunctioning, but we have changes in our habitat that are very, very different from just 100 years ago, actually just different from 40 and 50 years ago. For some species like the pika, they're not likely to survive in most places because they can only move up so high before they run out of mountaintop. I could take any of you on a drive through the Stanislaus National Forest or the private timberlands that haven't been clear cut yet, and I can show you conditions that are not always with as many dead trees as this, but they're scattered all across. And this year the fir engraver beetle started really hitting the firs up in the upper elevations. This is a picture I took last year at Calaveras Big Tree State Park. It isn't down in the giant sequoia groves, but it's an example, even in places that have been managed lovingly and carefully, beetles overwhelm the tree's defenses and make major changes. So this is a picture from up in Canada. And last winter, there was a drought period in Canada that had a firestorm that was something I had never ever seen in any photos before. These forests are generally less than 100 feet tall, and yet that wall of flame that's coming because of the extreme drought conditions and the amount of gas and everything, those flames are 800, 1,000, 1,500 feet in the air coming off of trees that are only 80 feet tall. This has been a period of extreme fire conditions, not just this year, but in the last 15 years or so. It's just gotten beyond anything in any recorded history. And the more that you go online and you follow up on the different fires, this is up in Washington this summer. Look at this landscape. Where does wildlife go to get away from a wall of flame moving instead of a fire creeping around where the deer come through, hop over, work over here, and may even stop and eat a few feet away from where the fire is burning, which is what more the conditions used to be. So we are facing a crisis in the Sierra Nevada of too much fuel, too many forests that haven't been thinned, too many areas that haven't had prescribed fire or managed wildfire through them, and now accumulation of all of that. And this is a picture I got from the Santa Rosa Napa fires. It's heartbreaking because this is the kind of condition that people were dying in, and not just having their neighborhoods burn up, but it is a terrible, terrible way to go. So we have forests that generally could be extremely resistant to fire because they've existed for tens of thousands of years with fire as an unregulated, unmanaged part of the ecological processes. And they're fully adapted to it. And yet, because of the changes that we've made, we now have to figure out solutions. This is Dr. Eric Knapp, that actually was the editor of the Sacramento Bee, who we had a field trip with, to try and get him and other media to understand about the issue and about possible solutions. So instead of this type habitat, how we can get prescribed fire back in, how we can get ecological logging, thinning logging, the GTR 220, and instead of doing what's happening on private lands, where they're literally clear-cutting everything and then planting with tree plantations that just provide fuel, that there is a solution of thinning logging, of opening up areas, and doing all kinds of restoration. So some people in this room, I know just from talking earlier, have already been out and been part of volunteer projects to help plant trees and burn areas. And that is a great need because in many of these sites, the Forest Service doesn't have the funding or the capacity to get all the trees planted that it would like to do. And this is just an example. Last year, one of our workday projects, we actually had 2 of them, were out there with volunteers, people like you guys, planting trees. A second is moving past fire and fuels, just remembering there's all these other issues. So there are effects from maybe livestock grazing in public land. I put in a few pictures because in the last few weeks, I've been really frustrated by the damage that I've seen to meadows. And I'm going to show you, if I get to this next picture, this is a springs area called Indian Springs on the Stanislaus Forest. It's about 4 acres. The cows just hammered it, chiseled it, pocked it, and tore it up. And when I was taking these pictures, the frustration is this is a priceless area that is just a tiny fraction of 1% of the forest being wetland areas, and yet you can see it's just like a feedlot with all the trampling, the pocking, the contamination of the water and other things that are happening. All of these issues add up. The roads, there's 25,000 miles of roads, maybe 15,000 of them are dirt roads out in the national forest. Many of them carved through the forest and change subsurface water flows. And many of them also funnel water at the end of the winter when there's snow melt and create ruts, especially where people go with their four-wheel drives and intentionally try and go places that are muddy to show where they've been with their vehicle. And a last issue I'm just touching on is there are wildlife species that are literally at the brink. Sierra Nevada red fox, there may be 30 individuals in a region stretching from the Ebbets Pass to the north edge of Yosemite Park. There may be another 40 to 50 up in the Lassen Park area, but there may be less than 100 Sierra Nevada red foxes that are able to live at 10 and 11,000 feet, 9,000 feet, and persist through the incredible winters and deep snows. There may be less than 100 left because of all the things that we've done to alter our forest and our conditions. So I'm hoping tonight that it's not just a downer, like, look at all the bad things that are happening, but it's something that makes you aware there are solutions. We actually have science-based solutions of getting more prescribed fire back in the environment, getting more thinning logging done in areas that are accessible and strategic, having more restoration projects done, and thinking proactively, we do have climate change coming. How can we respond to that in a fashion that minimizes the risk for the resources and that actually will provide for longer-term sustainability? So if I can go through these last few slides, whether it's for an Ensatina salamander or a saw-whet owl, or I'm going to stand over on this side, maybe that'll help, or for any of the other species that are out there, and maybe we'll just stop since this is not working. Okay, I'll try that. So mountain lady slipper or some of the other species.
Hit the space bar on the computer.
Oh, okay, on the computer, sorry. Oh yeah, that'll work. All right, so I thought you were talking about space where I'd make this work. So for all the plants, the species that are out there, there's so much that hopefully you guys care about, you know, whether wood ducks or the gray foxes or the fawns, or just for all the recreational opportunities that are there. So thank you guys for taking the time tonight to at least understand that there are issues and also that there are solutions if we can get enough support and also find ways that we're not polarizing and attacking, but building political support for working together. So thank you guys.